Hello, everyone. I'm Eric D'Souza, and you are joining us for another episode of Crime Writers of Canada's podcast, where we are interviewing the members of Crime Writers of Canada who have been nominated for an Award of Excellence in 2026. Today, I'm happy to say we have a reoccurring guest, Lorna Poplak, who's been nominated before. Hi, Lorna. How are you?
Hi, Eric. I'm good. Thanks very much. And it's nice to be chatting to you again.
It's a pleasure to chat with you again, too, because I know you're
Yeah.
going to tell us some really fun stories. Um, Your book, On the Lam, Great and Not So Great Escapes from Prison, published by Dundurn Press, has been nominated for a Brass Knuckles Award for Best Nonfiction Crime Book, sponsored by David Reed Simpson Law Firm in Hamilton. A little bit about you. Lorna is a Toronto-based writer, editor, and researcher drawn to the dark side of history. With a background in law, literature, information technology, and technical communications, Lorna has written scientific and historical articles, travel pieces, short fiction, and a radio play. She is a member of Crime Writers of Canada, Sisters in Crime, and Mesdames of Mayhem. Lorna has written three true crime books: Drop Dead, A Horrible History of Hanging in Canada, The Dawn, The Story of Toronto's Infamous Jail, and On the Lam, Great and Not So Great Escapes from Prison. The Dawn was shortlisted for both the Crime Writers of Canada Award, Excellence, and the Heritage Toronto Book Award. If any of you are fans of this interview, I interviewed her on our YouTube page for both the other previous books. In the intro of your book, On the Lam, Great and Not So Great Escapes from Prison, you ask the question, what is the measure of a successful escape? You have David St. Onge, historian and curator of Canada's Penitentiary Museum in Kingston, Ontario, puts it this way: is it getting out or staying out? What did you focus on in this book?
Well, I basically focused on escapes. And as I explain, some of the escapes were successful in the sense that people actually managed to get out. Some of them were not successful, abortive escapes, people did not manage to get out, and some of them were deadly. And I don't want to get too much into the story to sort of mention what my conclusion was at the end, but in a sense, what I was trying to do was leave the question open to my readers. Um, what would the reader, in going through all these stories, think was a successful escape from prison? Is it just getting out, just managing to leave the confines of the prison? Is it staying out? In which case, how long do you stay out for? Is it a day, a week, a year? Or, and this is something that occurred to me continually as I was writing the book, does one never actually escape? People who do escape can be out for years on end. What is their mindset? Are they always looking over their shoulder, wondering, sort of if the heavy hand of the law is going to sort of come down on them? So I wonder. And I still wonder, and I leave it to the reader to make up their own minds. What is the measure of a successful escape from prison?
Let's just talk about the escape itself. I haven't read all of your book, but I read some of your book, and there are some, I'm not going to call it fun, but very imaginative ways to escape from prison that I read about. Could you give us a few examples?
I suppose that one of the most imaginative escapes of all was the one that I launched the book with. And this was, and I know you mentioned this as we were chatting before, sort of getting online. This was a fellow whose name was Fred Cadadoo. And he escaped from Millhaven Institution. This is a high security, a high level security prison in Ontario in 1980. And the way he managed to escape was by hollowing out the cafeteria trays. So the system in Millhaven at that time was that at the end of dinner, the trays, the dirty trays, would all be sort of piled up on steel uh, wagons, and they would be trucked out to be washed at another facility. So what Caradu did was he hollowed out the center of these trays. So a whole pile of trays, he hollowed out the center, he glued the sides together, and he put a couple of trays, just regular trays on top. So that what he did was make a hidey hole for himself. So what he did on that particular evening in May 1880 was he curled himself up, he inserted himself into this hidey hole, and he was wheeled off the premises. He went to Bath Institution, where he just exited from his hidey hole. He picked up a knife, and by the following morning, people in Ontario and the rest of Canada knew that a dangerous and armed offender was on the run. So this was really, I mean, I came across this particular escape on a visit to Kingston Penitentiary Museum, which is in Kingston. It's called Canada's Penitentiary Museum, and that's in Kingston. And I actually saw a picture. It wasn't a picture, it was an actual thing. The pile of trays that had been hollowed out, leaving the space in between. And it was just incredible. And I thought to myself at that point, if there's some way that I can insinuate that into the book, I would. So it's a story, it's a kind of a throwaway story. It launches the book, but it does show you the sort of the lengths that people can go to in order to get out of prison. There were others as well. I'll mention just a couple more. Um, One that happened at Ocala Prison. This was in Burnaby, British Columbia. Is that in your neck of the woods,
It's pretty close.
Burnaby?
Yes, it is.
Pretty close. Okay. So Ocala Prison is now no more. It was closed down in the early 1990s, but it was there. It existed for just under 90 years. And it was described as a punishing but easily escapable prison. That's how one commentator described it. And this was no exaggeration. In a period of 50 years, between 1940 and 1990, some 890 offenders, men, women, and youthful offenders, got out of Ocala. But one of the most outstanding ones happened in the 1930s. It was, I think, 1937, when two escapees managed to get into um, there was a room that had been set aside for hangings, because Ocala, like the Don jail and other jails in Canada, was a hanging jail. So there was a small execution chamber, and these two men managed to get into the execution chamber, and it looks like they didn't get in on their own. They had help, because the doors were sealed and locked after them. So in other words, they were let in by somebody, possibly collusion from a guard. That's highly likely, although in my records and in my research, I never found, that they had actually sort of located somebody who might have helped them. But they got into this room, and in between times when it wasn't being used as an execution chamber, it was used as a storage room. So they didn't hunker down for the night. They didn't do that. What they did was they took blankets and towels and sheets, and they tied them together to form ropes. They pushed out a window, and they let the ropes out the window, climbed down, and they were gone. And, this sort of, I found that a very cheeky escape, to escape from the execution chamber itself. So that was in the 1930s, but, there were many more escapes from Ocala, which I go into in some detail in the book. But another cheeky escape that really tickled my fancy took place in Ontario in, when was it? 1979 it was. And this involved a man whose name was Stephen Reed. And Stephen Reed was sort of very bright, very intelligent, but he got into a life of crime very early on. And I can only say he initially did not live up to his potential. And he became a robber. He got put into jail, and he ended up in a jail called Joyceville in Ontario, which was a medium security jail. And on a certain occasion, he was sent out, he was allowed by the warden to go on a field trip with a guard. So the two of them went on a field trip. On the way back, he persuaded the guard against all the regulations to have lunch at a little restaurant in the town. This was in Kingston. So the two of them went into the restaurant, and Stephen, at a certain point, excused himself for a washroom break, and he never came back. So what's really funny is that the local newspaper picked up on this, and there's a wonderful picture, which I have in my book, of a picture of Stephen Reed, and underneath a little article with a caption saying, "The one that got away." And it describes how Stephen Reed went to this fish restaurant in the middle of the day for fish and chips. And it wasn't the fish that got away, but Stephen Reed himself. So, that was really a cheeky little escape that's I've got not only documented, but I've got a picture of that in the book as well. There were so many more, but, those are the ones that come to the top of my head at the moment.
Yep, don't tell us too many.
No, 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 no. But there are a few. There are many.
Um, what I'm wondering then is prison is obviously most prisons, not all of them, have been hard to escape from. But with modern technology, is it near impossible to escape?
Um, it's more difficult. It is more difficult. And certainly, sort of as technology has improved, they've become more and more methodologies to keep people inside. And these have always existed, especially with the sort of high security prisons, maximum security prisons, where there are things like sensors around the building, there are cameras everywhere, but people still manage to escape. And sometimes they escape through the most mundane of ways. For example, some of them, for example, when being processed, are just let go in error. This happens. There was a big case in Ontario, maybe about a month ago, of 150 people in the last few years who were mistakenly let out of prison. And this is something that I examine in the book as well. These erroneous escapes, which take place, and they still do. But in the grand scheme of things, I must add, in the grand scheme of things, uh, when one thinks that maybe 50, 60,000 of people are released from federal institutions in the year, a small proportion of them get out. But that doesn't mean that these escapes are not significant, because there is always a cost when someone escapes. It might be a cost to the escapee. I mean, I tell stories in the book of escapees who have killed in the process of escaping. There's a very sad story out of Kingston about a guard, a messenger in the Kingston Penitentiary, who was shot when just after befriending an inmate who escaped. So there are costs. There are financial costs. To track down escapees is very costly. So, and also the sort of underlying cost. For example, in one of the stories that I tell, escapees from a prison, one of them escaped, and when he was still in prison, he threatened his girlfriend. He phoned her up, threatened his girlfriend. He threatened to kill her, and he was on the lam for 6 months. So she lived in terror for a period of 6 months, not knowing whether he would find her and do her harm. So there are costs all the way along the line.
One thing I know about you, Lorna, is you love love to do your research. I imagine you did a lot of research on this one. So, what kind of research did you do? How did you get these stories?
Well, I used, in all three of my books, I used archival newspapers. Those are a big thing. Um, I I have a subscription to something which is called newspapers.com, and I recommend that anybody who's interested in doing research gets a subscription. And they have newspapers from all over the world, and they have really streamlined their methodologies, and it's really easy to find people and to sort of narrow down to the period that you want, the person that you want. So that's archival newspapers, very useful. I sort of consulted statutes and official documents. That was another source. Interviews. I'm very keen on interviews, and for the latest one, I interviewed people on both sides of the bars, and it was very interesting interviewing a couple of prior guards, one from the Don jail, for example, who gave me information, and also people who were in prison with some of the escapees that I mentioned, and who gave me information about them. I went on field trips. I went to Ottawa a few times, to Library and Archives Canada. I went to Quebec. This was fun. I went to Montreal, where I visited prisons, Bordeaux prison. They wouldn't let me in, by the way. And I went to the archives there, the Quebec archives. So that was a really sort of fruitful source of information. And what I had fun with this time was consulting sites like Abe Books for out-of-print material. So, for example, there is a writer whose name is Caron, and he wrote about, the book is out of print now, but he wrote a book called Go Boy, about escaping and, sort of his experiences in the system. So I managed to get quite a few arcane out-of-print books through that.
Lorna, this seems like a fascinating book with a lot of really fun stories. Was there a goal that you had in mind when you set out to do this project?
Yes, I'll answer that very briefly. Um, the title of the book is Great and Not So Great Escapes from Prison. So we've got two streams, and I address these streams in the book. The one is the focus on prisons. So I discuss prisons, the origins, the conditions in the prison, and whether they were escapable or not. And on the other hand, I discuss the escapees, because the bottom line with me is always the human element. What possessed people? What encouraged them? What forced them to escape when the risk can be so high? So it was those two streams that I hope to examine and to lay bare to the public in my book.
Perfect. Lorna, as always, it was a pleasure chatting. I tell everyone I don't know who won this category, and I'm so happy that I think four of the members of Crime Writers of Canada are in this category. Many of the books from Dundurn. You're doing a great job. Keep it up.
Eric, I want to say thank you, firstly, to Crime Writers of Canada, because the slate is very strong, in my category, the brass knuckles. I mean, who wouldn't want to win a brass knuckles award? So it's very strong. So, but I'm absolutely honored that my book should be on the list, and I want to thank you and Crime Writers of Canada, and we'll take it from there. Thank you.